family pretty quickly if this is a case of forced entry, because the family wouldn't need to do that. The family would presumably have a key, and if they didn't have a key and they wanted to get in, they just knock on the door and Nancy Guthrie would open it.
It started with a silence that nobody could explain. Not the ordinary kind of quiet that settles over a neighborhood at the end of a long weekend. This was the kind of silence that arrives when something is deeply, irreversibly wrong. The kind that sits in a room after a door has been locked from the outside. The kind that lingers when someone who was supposed to be there is not. On the morning of February 1st, 2026, in a quiet residential neighborhood called the Catalina Foothills, just north of Tucson, Arizona, the home of 84-year-old Nancy Guthrie stood still. No movement, no signs of a normal morning, no lights switching on, no church service joining, no car pulling out, nothing. And that nothing would become the beginning of one of the most closely watched investigations in recent American history. Nancy had been dropped off at her home the previous night by her son-in-law.
While Nancy Guthrie's family stood before cameras with trembling voices and tear-filled eyes, pleading for answers, pleading for help, he was silent. While investigators executed search warrants and forensic teams mapped timelines minute by minute, he said nothing.
Tommaso Cioni, at approximately 9:50 in the evening. She had just come from a family dinner with her daughter Annie, who lived nearby. By all accounts, the night had been unremarkable. A grandmother returning home after an evening with family. A routine that had played out dozens of times before. The kind of evening that ends with a door closing softly and a light eventually going dark. Except this time, the light never came back on. Around noon on February 1st, a friend reached out after Nancy did not show up to watch an online church service. Something she never missed. That call became a concern. That concern became a report. And that report became a criminal investigation that would stretch across months, consume thousands of hours of law enforcement effort, and leave a family and a nation searching for answers that have not yet come. When authorities arrived at Nancy's home, they found something that immediately changed the nature of everything. There was evidence inside that residence that a crime had taken place. Bloodstains, confirmed by forensic analysis to be Nancy's own.
There are moments in an investigation that stop everyone in the room. Not because of what was expected, but because of what wasn't. For weeks, one man had said nothing. No interviews, no statements, no public appearances.
A Ring camera that had been mounted at the front of the house appeared to have been removed or tampered with. And surveillance footage from another angle captured something chilling. A masked, armed individual at Nancy's front door in the early hours of February 1st. A camera alert had been triggered at 2:12 in the morning. That detail matters. Think about that for a second. 2:12 in the morning. A masked figure at the door of an 84-year-old woman who lived alone. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos stood before cameras and said what investigators had already come to believe. Nancy Guthrie did not leave that home on her own. She had been taken, against her will. In the middle of the night. There was no forced entry that was immediately apparent, but there was evidence of a crime. There was blood, and there was a device, the pacemaker that Nancy depended on to keep her heart functioning, that stopped syncing with her Apple devices at 2:28 in the morning on February 1st, 2026. At 2:28 a.m., that signal went dark. That is where this case becomes something that investigators describe only in careful, deliberate language. Because a pacemaker does not simply stop syncing on its own. It syncs when it is near the device it is paired with. And when it stops, especially in the context of everything else found at that home, it tells a story that no one wanted to hear. Nancy Guthrie had lived in the Tucson area for more than 5 decades. She moved there with her family in the early 1970s and never left. She was born on January 27, 1942, in Fort Wright, Kentucky, and had built a life in that Arizona community that was as steady and rooted as the desert landscape around it. She was a churchgoer. She was known in her neighborhood. She was mentally sharp, independent, and deeply loved. She raised 3 children, Savannah, Annie, and Cameron, largely on her own after losing her husband, Charles Guthrie, in 1988, when he passed away during a mining exploration trip in Mexico at just 49 years old. Nancy kept going. She always kept going.
Yes. So what he saw, Brian Engine saw, was like the remnants of a Nest camera, not even
Correct.
the Nest camera, right? Like it was clear to him that they had been removed, which is not
Yeah.
the same thing as destroyed. The sheriff is
There
saying
is.
that they were
Yeah.
destroyed right before we got to them.
Her daughter Savannah is a co-anchor of NBC's Today Show, one of the most recognized faces in American broadcast journalism. And when the news of her mother's disappearance reached the public, the weight of what this family was carrying became impossible to ignore. Hi viewers, before we go any further, we want to ask you something personal. If you have an elderly parent or grandparent living alone, what is the one thing you make sure to check on them about every single day? Drop it in the comments below. Your answer might mean more than you know. Within hours of the disappearance being reported, local authorities, the FBI, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, and search and rescue teams were all on the ground. Cadaver dogs were deployed. Drones swept the surrounding terrain. Aerial resources were brought in. Neighborhoods were canvassed. Thousands of tips poured in from across the country. And yet, Nancy Guthrie has not been found. By February 2nd, the case shifted. It was no longer a search operation. It was a criminal investigation. Nancy's home was now formally a crime scene. Homicide investigators were called in. Sheriff Nanos was direct in his language. Whatever happened inside that house was not an accident. It was not a medical episode that went unnoticed. Someone came into that home, and Nancy was taken from it. Days later, ransom notes began to appear. Multiple media outlets received communications demanding payment. One demanding millions of dollars in Bitcoin with a specific cryptocurrency address and a deadline attached. Another arrived at a Tucson television station containing details about Nancy's home and what she had been wearing the night she disappeared. Investigators reviewed those letters carefully and shared them with the FBI. But authorities made no confirmation about whether any of them came from the actual perpetrators. 2 deadlines in those notes passed. Nothing. FBI officials, law enforcement experts, and retired investigators who have followed this case closely all point to the same unsettling assessment. Whoever did this did not act carelessly. The masked individual captured on that doorbell camera came prepared. The timing, deep into the night when the neighborhood was still, suggests someone who had watched, who had planned, and who had a reason. A retired detective, Bob Gilliam, who has studied the footage extensively, pointed to something that few had initially noticed. The masked figure on the front porch appeared to have something in his pants pocket. Something with an antenna. Gilliam's conclusion, shared publicly. That detail is consistent with a radio communication device. And you do not bring a radio to a scene like that if you are working alone. That single observation expanded the scope of everything. Because if there was more than one person involved, if this was coordinated, planned, and executed across multiple individuals, then this was not an opportunistic act. This was something else entirely. And the question of who and why and where Nancy Guthrie is today becomes not just heavier. It becomes something that demands answers. As of today, the investigation is in its 4th month. The FBI continues to analyze DNA evidence recovered from the scene. Mixed DNA samples were collected, and the analysis has been escalated, passed from a Florida lab to the FBI itself, and then to a San Francisco forensics lab that has previously assisted in other significant criminal investigations. Investigators believe that the results of that DNA analysis could represent a turning point. The reward for information in this case stands at over $1 million. And the community of Catalina Foothills, neighbors who installed new cameras, who now watch unfamiliar faces more closely, who walk differently through their own streets, is still waiting. Nancy Guthrie has not come home. 86 days. No confirmed suspect. No arrest. A family in the public eye carrying something that no public platform can fully hold. And somewhere in the hours between that family dinner on January 31st and the moment that Pacemaker went silent at 2:28 in the morning, there is a truth that investigators are still working to reach. A truth that is held piece by piece in surveillance footage, in forensic evidence, in DNA samples, in a masked figure silhouette on a doorbell camera, and in the memories of everyone who saw Nancy last. The evidence is there. The investigation continues. And the most important piece of this case, the one detail that could change everything, may not have been made public yet. This is the story of Nancy Guthrie. And it is far from over. If this story stopped you in your tracks, if you believe Nancy deserves answers, please subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Every week, this channel covers true cases that remind us what courage, truth, and the search for justice really look like. Share this video. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters in keeping stories like this alive. Because sometimes, the only thing standing between silence and the truth is the people who refuse to stop asking questions.
They came in through the back door,
Yep.
then they got her, then they brought her out the front door after injuring her.
Could.
Then the blood trail continued just to the driveway.
Well, it didn't.
Where they then put her in a car.
That's the problem.
It ended well prior to the driveway?
Yeah, the blood trail is just at the front door on those tiles. Then the gravel starts right away, and it's a walkway to the driveway, and it's not close. I mean, it's a bit of a ways.
She had lived in Tucson for more than 50 years. That is not background information. That is the foundation of everything. Because when a person builds 5 decades of life in one place, the same church, the same neighborhood, the same quiet routines, their absence does not go unnoticed. It gets felt immediately by everyone who knew where she was supposed to be. Nancy Guthrie was born on January 27, 1942, in Fort Wright, Kentucky. She came to Tucson in the early 1970s with her family and never left. She raised 3 children, Savannah, Annie, and Cameron. She lost her husband, Charles, in 1988, when he passed away during a mining trip in Mexico at just 49 years old. She did not collapse under that loss. She kept moving. She kept showing up. She managed her own life, her own schedule, her own home in the Catalina foothills, alone at 84 and by choice. Her family described her as mentally sharp and independent. She was active in her community. She attended church without fail. She had friends who expected to hear from her. She had a daughter living nearby. She had a son-in-law who drove her home after dinner on the last night anyone saw her. She also had a pacemaker, a device that worked quietly to keep her heart functioning. A device that, as investigators would come to understand, had been recording the most critical hours of her life without anyone asking it to. On January 31, 2026, Nancy had dinner with her daughter Annie and Annie's husband, Tommaso Cioni. An ordinary evening. When it ended, Tommaso drove Nancy home and dropped her off at approximately 9:50 p.m. He watched her go inside. There was nothing unusual, no reason to pause. That was the last confirmed sighting of Nancy Guthrie. The next morning, a friend waited for her to join an online church service. Nancy did not appear. She did not answer. A report was made around noon on February 1st. Authorities arrived at her home and found what they were not prepared for. Blood at the scene, confirmed forensically as Nancy's. A Ring camera that appeared to have been tampered with or removed. And surveillance footage showing a masked, armed individual standing at Nancy's front door at 2:12 in the morning. 16 minutes later, at 2:28 a.m., Nancy's pacemaker stopped syncing with her Apple devices. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos was direct. The evidence at the scene indicated a crime had taken place inside that home. Nancy did not leave on her own. She was taken. By February 2nd, the case was formally reclassified. Not a missing persons report. A criminal investigation. Homicide detectives were brought in. The home was designated a crime scene, and the search that had started as a welfare check became something that would involve the FBI US. Customs and Border Protection, aerial units, cadaver dogs, and thousands of investigative hours. Then came the ransom notes. Within days, multiple media outlets received demands for payment. A Tucson television station received a letter containing specific details about Nancy's home and what she had been wearing on January 31st. TMZ received a second note demanding millions of dollars in Bitcoin with a wallet address and a deadline. A third communication surfaced online claiming someone had seen Nancy alive in the Mexican state of Sonora. Investigators reviewed all of them. The FBI was brought in on every one. 2 deadlines passed. No payment. no proof of life. And then investigators discovered that at least one of those notes had not come from whoever took Nancy. A man from the Los Angeles area named Derek Colella had sent text messages to members of the Guthrie family, referencing Bitcoin and a transaction. He was arrested 4 days after the disappearance, charged federally with transmitting a ransom demand in interstate commerce without disclosing his identity. Investigators determined he had been following the case on television and found the family's contact information through a third-party website. He was, in the FBI's own language, an imposter. FBI Special Agent in charge Heath Yankis stated it plainly. Those attempting to exploit this situation would be held accountable. But the real perpetrator remained unidentified. The masked figure on that footage had not been named. No motive had been established publicly, and the family of Nancy Guthrie was left with something no investigation, no reward money, and no public attention had yet been able to resolve: the complete absence of the woman they loved. Savannah Guthrie, one of the most recognized journalists in American broadcast media, took leave from the Today Show. Fans gathered outside the studio in New York wearing yellow ribbons. Signs reading, "We love you, Savannah," lined the street. Another sign carried words that Savannah had credited to her mother. Advice Nancy had given her after losing her father as a teenager: decide and do. 2 words. And in the middle of an investigation with no confirmed answer, they carried everything. Because somewhere between the quiet end of a family dinner and the moment that Pacemaker went silent, an answer existed. Investigators were working toward it, but it had not arrived yet, and the evidence was only beginning to speak. The night had a shape to it. Investigators knew this because the data showed them. Not theories, not assumptions. Log data, automatic, continuous. The kind that runs in the background of a life without being asked. A pacemaker syncing to a watch, a doorbell registering motion, a camera capturing a face or the deliberate covering of one. 2. 12 a.m. on February 1st, the doorbell camera triggered an alert. A masked, armed individual appeared at the entrance of Nancy's home. The FBI released that footage publicly. A still image and a short video clip showing a figure dressed entirely to conceal identity, standing at the front door of an 84-year-old woman who was inside. At 2:28 a.m., Nancy's pacemaker stopped syncing with her Apple devices. 16 minutes after that camera alert, authorities confirmed they used a helicopter equipped with a Bluetooth scanning system to search the area around Nancy's home, flying over the residential grid of the Catalina foothills, scanning for the radio frequency of a single medical device. That detail alone reflects the precision this investigation demanded from its earliest hours. The signal was not found. Retired Detective Bob Gilliam studied the publicly released footage carefully and identified something that had not been widely addressed. The masked figure on the porch appeared to have an object in his pants pocket, visible antenna at the top. Gilliam stated, without qualification, that the object was consistent with a radio communication device, a walkie-talkie, and in his professional assessment, you do not bring a radio to a scene like that if you are working alone. Former Sergeant John Lamb, also a retired law enforcement professional, agreed. The logistics of what appeared to have taken place: entering a home, managing an elderly woman with limited mobility, exiting without detection, pointed toward multiple people. At minimum 2, possibly 3. 1 at the entry point, 1 managing the perimeter, 1 controlling the exit route. This was not impulsive. This was coordinated. Someone had knowledge of Nancy's home, her routine, her schedule, and when she would be alone and when she would next be expected somewhere. That level of preparation takes time, takes observation, and it points to a motive that existed before February 1st. The ransom notes, reviewed alongside this operational picture, raised their own questions. The first letter, received by a Tucson television station, contained details about Nancy's home and clothing that had not been made public. Investigators protected those specific contents deliberately. That protection means something. Those details were being held back because they had value in identifying the source. If whoever sent that letter knew things that only someone present that night would know, then the letter itself was evidence. 2 deadlines on the Bitcoin demands passed with no transaction and no confirmation that Nancy was alive. The FBI could not verify whether any of the notes came from those actually holding her. And the investigation, now formally a criminal case involving homicide detectives, federal agents, and forensic specialists, pressed forward without a publicly named suspect. Search operations continued. Cadaver dogs worked the terrain around the Catalina foothills in multiple passes. Aerial units swept the surrounding landscape. The neighborhood was canvassed repeatedly. Thousands of tips arrived from across the country. Every credible detail was followed up on. None of it produced Nancy. By mid-February, a person of interest was detained following a traffic stop in Rio Rico, approximately 60 miles south of Tucson. A gray Range Rover was searched and towed. A federal search warrant was executed at a residence 2 miles from Nancy's home. 4 people were detained across those operations. All were later released. No charges were filed. Sheriff NamUs confirmed. The person detained in that traffic stop was investigators' person of interest. He had been cooperative. He was released. No connection to Nancy's disappearance was established. That pattern, significant investigative movement, followed by release, followed by public silence, defined the rhythm of this case through February and into March. Movement without resolution. Evidence without arrest. A case that was clearly active, clearly serious, clearly consuming enormous resources, but not yet producing the answer that mattered most. The community around the Catalina foothills had already begun to change. New cameras were installed. Neighbors walked their streets with a different kind of attention. Sheriff NamUs had acknowledged publicly that whoever was responsible could still be in the area. That statement was not speculation. It was an honest assessment from the person leading the investigation, and it settled over that neighborhood in a way that did not lift. By late April 2026, the case had crossed into its 4th month with no arrest and no confirmed suspect. 86 days. The media presence that had once crowded the streets of the Catalina foothills had largely pulled back. Coverage had slowed. The public attention had shifted in the way that public attention always does, toward the next thing, the next story, the next headline. But the investigation had not stopped. The forensic work, in particular, had only grown more intensive. Mixed DNA samples recovered from the scene, meaning DNA from more than one person, inside a home where a single elderly woman lived alone, had been sent for analysis. First to a laboratory in Florida, then escalated to the FBI's own forensic resources, then forwarded to a San Francisco-based forensic laboratory with a documented track record in high-profile criminal cases, including the prosecution of Rex Hoyerman, who pleaded guilty to 8 murders on Long Island. That escalation is significant. It means investigators were not satisfied with the initial analysis. It means the samples were complex enough to require specialist handling. And it means that the people running this investigation believed those samples could identify who was inside that house. A source within the law enforcement community told NewsNation that the investigative team assigned early in the case lacked experience in cases of this nature and made procedural errors in the initial stages. Separately, records obtained by Fox News Digital revealed that the head of the Pima County Sheriff's Department's homicide and cold case units had been rotated out in the year before Nancy's disappearance. Those 2 details, placed side by side, raised questions about how the earliest hours of the investigation were handled, and whether any critical evidence was compromised before the full weight of federal resources arrived. Retired FBI Supervisory Special Agent Jason Pack had described the February search warrant execution as having the hallmarks of investigators acting on specific actionable intelligence, not a broad sweep but a targeted, informed move. That assessment suggested that at some point, something concrete had pointed investigators toward a specific location, a specific vehicle, or a specific person. And yet that move had not produced an arrest. Cold case specialist Brian Martin raised a possibility publicly that investigators had not stated directly, but that the physical evidence made difficult to dismiss. Nancy, at 84, with limited mobility and a heart condition requiring a pacemaker, had been subjected to an extreme physical event. The stress of being forcibly removed from one's home, at that age and in that condition, places severe strain on the cardiovascular system. Martin stated that whoever planned this may not have fully understood her physical vulnerability, and that a medical crisis during or after the abduction could have forced a significant change in what happened next. That is the kind of analysis that experienced investigators do not set aside. Through all of it, the reward stood at over $1 million. Thousands of tips had been received and reviewed. The FBI had increased its own reward from $50,000 to $100,000. And still no confirmed breakthrough, no named suspect, no arrest. The case of Nancy Guthrie, as it entered its fourth month, remained one of the most heavily resourced and closely watched missing persons investigations in recent American history. And it remained unsolved. The evidence does not disappear. It waits. That single truth is what every investigator, every forensic specialist, and every retired detective who has spoken publicly about this case keeps returning to. Because waiting in this context is not the same as stalling. It is the nature of the work. DNA analysis takes time. Federal cases take time. The kind of precision that produces an arrest that leads to a conviction, that takes time. Nancy Guthrie has been missing since February 1, 2026. No suspect has been named. No arrest has been made. The investigation continues. What also continues is the broader question this case has placed in front of the public. Nancy was not isolated. She was not without family. She had people nearby. She had routines that others depended on and checked against. She had a son-in-law who had dropped her off just hours before she was taken. And still, in 16 minutes, in the space between a camera alert and a pacemaker going silent, she was gone. That reality changed things in the Catalina foothills. People installed cameras they had not thought to install before. They watched their streets differently. They called their parents more. The ripple effect of what happened to Nancy Guthrie extended far beyond a single investigation in a single Arizona neighborhood, because the story reached people who recognized, in some part of themselves, that the people they love are not always as protected as they assume. The Guthrie family has carried this with a kind of steadiness that is hard to fully account for. Savannah Guthrie returned to the Today Show in early April, more than 2 months after her mother disappeared. Not because the pain had resolved, because life continues even when answers have not arrived. Her mother's own words, decide and do, have lived inside this family through every week of this investigation. A trial date has been set for June 23rd at the federal courthouse in Tucson for Derek Colella, the man who sent fake ransom texts to the family. That trial will not answer the central question, but it is a marker, a reminder that every thread in this case is being followed, including the ones designed to mislead. The central thread, the masked figure, the coordinated entry, the mixed DNA, the forensic results still being processed, is being pulled carefully, with the full weight of federal resources and the kind of scientific analysis that has resolved cases that seemed, at the time, impossible. Somewhere in that work is the name of the person who came to Nancy Guthrie's door at 2:12 in the morning. Somewhere in a laboratory in a federal case file, in the evidence recovered from a home in the Catalina foothills, the answer exists. It is not gone. It has not faded. It is waiting for the analysis to finish, for the right detail to connect, for the truth to surface the way it always does, quietly, precisely, and with no ability to be undone. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. She had lived in Tucson for 50 years. She raised 3 children. She attended her church. She showed up for the people she loved. She deserves answers. Her family deserves answers. And the most important detail in this case may still be coming. If the story stayed with you, subscribe to this channel right now and turn on your notifications so you never miss what comes next. Every week, this channel covers real cases that deserve to be told with honesty and care. Share this video. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Your voice keeps these conversations alive. Because some of the most important things that have ever come to light began with someone who simply refused to stop paying attention.